complete. So whatever condition I'm in, that's where it's at. What you do with airlines have seen that cannot connect planes and things like this, so I'll do my best. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some slides and kind of explain my way through it, or explain my way out of it. But suffice it to say, it goes back, way back. Remember the conversation back in 1969, trying to get my master's degree. And I always had this problem. The problem arose, how do you do with a course content? And I somewhat facetiously came up with the idea I could create, we were talking about certificates, courses, and stuff like this. I could create courses on on vacuum cleaners 101. And I could create a bunch of things on vacuum cleaners. How they're manufactured, what they look like, the types, and everything else. And I could get so specialized that I could be really into vacuum cleaners. I don't know why it's seized on that instead of blue pals and something like this. It's a joke, not even on this, but I can make a specialty out of anything. It has to do with how much detail or granularity that you want or something. Now, I'm going to get to this thing, if I get this thing, I'm going to flip through these things here. Where is the, oh, it's already up front. This was the original problem. The sufficient, necessary, disciplinary, and stuff like that. I'm going to basically argue you cannot really escape this at some level. It all has to do with context. Now, we had a presentation here about academic globalization. And we talk about all the qualitative things and things like this. It works or it doesn't work. And I have problems with stuff like that. What do you mean, does it work? For whom? At what level? Context. Academic, what is that? And I have a tendency to kind of pick on words like that. And I'm your basic pain in the ass when it comes to stuff like this. Because I'm going to seize on stuff like that, and I'm going to grab a hold of it because I'm manic, and I've got a mood, and I'm going to grab on it like a dog grabs on a rag, and I'm going to make a mess of things. So that's what I do. I grab a hold of things like that, and I want to know, what do you mean it worked? I don't think academic globalization, or whatever that means, I call it technological globalization, I don't think it's working very well for the species. So I don't think it's really working very well at all. I think it's nice in one sense. I'm glad to see what's happening in one sense. But I think we've got such an information overload, glut, and stuff like that, we're getting used to sound bites. I'm wondering about some aspects of the globalization. But part of it has to do with the larger conversations, two conversations going on, having to do with disciplines and what is academic and what is technological and things like this. And it gets into his question about higher education versus the higher instruction. So all these issues are all kind of related into this whole, into this web. So the necessary and sufficient thing, I think, is going to resolve itself down the road, depending upon what context you're talking about. Terms. What is a discipline? Now, some of the stuff you've seen before, not too original today, too very original at all. What is a discipline? It means that you're going to be focused, you're going to be mature, you're going to concentrate on whatever, you're going to define what you're doing, kind of like martial style in some cases, that's my field, and that's it. And you turn it into an ideology, a set of ideas that's not subject to question. That's my field. And don't go outside that field. Characteristic, focus, maturity, skill. I know the slides. Focus, maturity, skill, knowledge. Area of expertise, knowledge. That's what we're going to get to that later. I would argue in many ways that disciplines many times are created as a result of narcissism and personality disorders. And I would argue that I've got my field by discipline, and I would argue in many cases, not all, that it is an instrument of control. All these boards, journals, and what you see out there, you're going to, now I've seen this. I used to be accused of doing philosophical sociology, philosophy, sociology, and stuff like that. You're out in the field, and I remember wrangling with a committee about that. And so you're out of your field. And I know exactly what Nagi's talking about. You're just out of your field, and they just so narrowly focused. I would argue that anybody argues for such a narrowly focused idea of what their field is, it has to do with this narcissism that is a way I can control you by forcing you to do this way, only this way, in the military-like fashion. I would argue, I think it's part of the problem, not all. There's so much simplicity. I would call it what I call superfluous novelty or superfluous variety. You create something new that's really subsequently the same as that as if you call it something else. There's another issue. I think also it might have to do with knowledge quality. There's some issues with that when you create your discipline. And so, I haven't seen some of this so far. I'm going to go to the next one. Again, I would argue that in many cases, again, I'm somewhat generalizing, that when you talk about the disciplinarian or somebody really versed in discipline, there's an ego issue involved. They're not willing to go outside that boundary. So you submit an article in the journal, so forth, they won't accept it because you're outside your field. I would argue in many cases that's an ego issue. You're dealing with a personality problem, not necessarily a substance problem or substance abuse. We went to the problem of jargon, explanatory words. Again, getting back to that little 1970s example, I could create courses on just about anything you want. Anybody else in this room can too. Again, how much power do you want to exert over somebody? What area, what opportunity is there to create instruments by creating a course or certification? I guess the argument rose back then about certifications. You have to have certification for everything. Anytime you turn around, you have to show a piece of paper, you have to publish, perish, whatever, and you have to show this little document saying that you really are, you have some knowledge in that area. So I think that's involved. So I think we're dealing many times with this personality issue. The jargon itself, you can read some of the stuff. You go to some of these very specialized conferences, and the people in the same room don't know what the hell the other one's talking about. That's how bad it can get. Now, interdisciplinary, I'm going to go through this whole chart. First of all, I can't read the thing, but I think everybody, we're going to go through this fairly quickly. I've got 40 slides here. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We all know what interdisciplinary is. It's basically one area, whatever you define that as, being able to integrate with what the other area is doing, talking with each other, and barring taking from one area, bringing into your area, and vice versa, and so forth. There are three areas when we talk talking about interdisciplinary and so forth. I'm going to get into the academic versus technological in a minute, because I think there is an interrelationship here. Because I'm not sure if there are, well, okay, we're going to talk about dialectics, the nature of the language that we're using in defining a discipline, boundary, granularity, and science in terms of technology and vice versa. So I'll try to relate these things. Then we'll discuss as sufficient necessary, and I think that will take care of itself. All right, dialectics is fairly simple, and I can run through this fairly quickly. Something in terms of what it isn't. Some of you have heard this discussion before, but those who are new, this is basically goes along. And this is how, I think is one reason why we cannot escape the fact that we're doing whatever interdisciplinary is. By force, at some level, in some context, we have to be doing interdisciplinary. It all depends upon what granularity. For example, this, a very simple example, this does not exist by itself. It exists in terms of what it is not. That's what basic dialectics is. An example. Something's apprehended in terms of what it exists because of what it is not. This is a process philosophy. You look at Alfred North Whitehead, things like that. You go back to the East Asian philosophies. That's essentially what their way of saying how something exists. Give an example. What do you see? Nothing, except blue. And now she knows where my idea of blue comes from. This kind of an example. I use blue, whatever. If I turn everything in this room blue, one shade of blue, you won't see anything at all. except when I have a contrast, this basic dialect, something in terms of what it is not. Now you see the circle, because the circle exists because of what that red isn't, i.e. blue. It's a processing. It's neither this nor that. It's this in terms of that. It's kind of a hard thing. We don't really have that concept in the West. Is anybody from East Asia here, from an East Asian country at all? All right, you get what I'm looking at? You getting at? Is that what I'm saying makes sense? Because it's endemic in the philosophy there. It's the idea of the dialectic, something in terms of what it is. It's opposites. Najee refers to opposites once in a while. But it's not simply this. It's this in terms of what it is not. You cannot see this by itself. Can you? Does that what I'm saying make sense? She understands what's because it's East Asian philosophy. Are you from East Asia? This is anybody else from East Asia here? Did you see that philosophy? It's dialectics. And we don't have that concept in this country very much. We're all object-oriented. It's this object, you concentrate on this object, and that's what it is. No, it's not this object. It's this in terms of what this object is not. That's how you know what that is. It sounds like a cartridge, but that's the way we understand it. And so when you're talking about a discipline, if I'm talking about material science, or talking about metallurgy, I'm going to be talking about something else at the same time, or something in terms of what it isn't, which is not metallurgy, like chemistry, something like that. So by perforce, by dialectics, I'm going to be drawing something else in, just by the very nature of what it is. So if I'm going to be talking about this, I'm going to be, in the process sense, talking about what it isn't. So at that very fundamental law, that very fundamental level, I'm going to be involving a larger thing than that, something of what it isn't. Same thing. So that's basically what it is. It's one of these. And you go through phenomenology of mind, and Hegel, for example, after 800 pages, you kind of get an idea what's coming. So you say shaking hill, I think you know what I'm drifting through. And that's one reason why you cannot, that we perforce, everything is interconnected. And there's one thing that's interesting in the United States. You look at a lot of the indigenous philosophies. There's a lot of that going on too. But that's what the Europeans couldn't get when they got over here. You had the native peoples, shut the hell up, you go away. Who? Who is it? Oh, Molly. No. No. Shut up. That's what I mean by technology. It's supposed to be an improvement on things. It's supposed to be an improvement. That's how I improve it. Shut the hell up. What are you thinking, Molly? Dialectics. It's a process. It's not object making, it's process making. So that's how we apprehend things. Learning, all that stuff. It's not this or that. And that's the thing, getting back to the indigenous populations. It's interesting because she is an indigenous person. I'm not sure of the tribe. No. She's a vice president. She's a vice president, the vice president of our organization, so I can get away with crap like that. I'll talk to you later in the board meeting. No. So something exists in terms of what isn't. Now, the nature of language is another reason, somewhat dialectic. Getting to Horne. No, air. Let's go to air first. First of all, language is naming and reference. I know something by naming it. If you don't understand what that is, you've never seen one before, I call it a whank. Now I know what it is. It's a whank. So every time we talk about this thing, and you know what I've never seen it before, I don't know what it is, but it's a whank. Now you know what I'm talking about, because I associate that with that. It's supposed to be a simplistic view of language, and I have a good friend who studied linguistics and say, that's not quite right. Well, okay, well that's the way it is. That's the way it should be. But anyway, What the nature of the language is that Ayer was arguing that everything is defined in terms of something else, i.e. another way of saying dialectics, or sort of the another thing too. So what I do is I say this is a blank blank. What's a blank blank? It is a piece of, okay, I take the word it, define that, a, define that, piece, define that, plastic, has a dictionary on that, and a bunch of other things. So what I do, ultimately, I'm able to define this thing in about 50 million words. And I come back to what this thing is. And that's what language, it's a web. That's what Ayer was arguing. Microsoft. There's a smell in this building somewhere. Do they get a conference going on here? I used to work for Microsoft. I get away with saying that.
What do they want with philosophy?
Huh?
What do they want with philosophy?
Who? I don't know. I came in and I had a long conversation with, I was doing documentation. Philosophers can't do anything like teach philosophy and get paid for it. So I was a technical writer for 23 years. So I go into all these job sites and describe everything. And that's the first part of science, scientific methods, the philosophy of science. You've got to be able to describe it before you do anything else. As a technical writer. There used to be, Collier wrote a work called How to Solve It. I'm writing a thing on how to describe it. You think that's easy, how to describe it? That's the first step of the scientific method.
Yeah.
Describing. The simplest way is mathematics. Binary. Everything can be reduced by binary. You've read my paper. Everything can be reduced by binary. So it's a web. Change.
Try page down.
We name everything. It's platypus is a key word for this animal that is wah, whatever it is. Very simple. It's a wah, or you can use 50,000 words to describe what this is. I'm going to lose that. I'm going to get back to the wrong. All right. So which is easier? Platypus or 50,000 words? So that's what happens. That's what Ayer was saying. It's a web. One word is defining a bunch of other words and stuff like this, and finally we come back to where we started. It's recursive. That's system essentially recursive. You would have these words in terms of each other ultimately wind up to the word. I'm just saying the same thing over again. Repeating myself and saying things again. As a professor, a redundancy professor. All right. Now, this is where it gets to Worf. Worf basically said, in essence, that the neurophysiology drives the idea, and ultimately that's the language. So when somebody says something, that's a reflection of what's going on up here. He says basically it rises out of the consciousness. And I don't think he uses brain mapping like we are now. But in essence, it comes from the consciousness. The consciousness gives rise to the language, not vice versa. So a lot of people think of it. Now we have the brain mapping, which ultimately gives rise to the word. As a sidebar on that, go to, for those who like, actually prefer to read, go to NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, and read their little webpage on research across domains. What that is they're doing brain mapping, and brain mapping to psychological states. And they're bringing genetics into the fold as well. So what will happen, ultimately, they don't say this, but you validate the DSM. That's a little sidebar issue on neurocognitive of consciousness. Very interesting little webpage. I urge everybody to look at that, because that's what they're doing. So what they do, if you have a mental state, what they're going to do is they're going to do a brain map of that. And so I have a depression, I have a mania like now, 30 cups of coffee, I have this and that over a period of time. What happens, that brain mapping will correlate with that mental state, and now you can classify individuals. DARPA had an interesting broad agency announcement, 11-5 sidebar, that they wanted to identify terrorists before they do terrorist acts by the brain map. and then you go into research across domains, and that can get to be a very interesting discussion. We'll have that offline. Anyway, back to this, tautological, that's what happens with air, the language of tautological is a web, and we come back over. Now, boundaries. Now this gets interesting. Boundaries. We're talking about disciplines. Back on track again. What is the boundary between discipline A and discipline B? Tell me where the red is, folks. I defy anybody to tell me where the red is. Draw me the boundary around the red. And I know how to take it. Thank you. Good. Everybody gets it. You can't. It's subjective. It gets into Heisenberg and people like that. You impose a limit. Calculus. You impose, am I correct? You impose a limit in calculus? Right. You determine the limit, right? Nobody up there determines the limits unless it's your professor. You determine the limit. You determine which slit the photon goes through. You determine what the color is. And just about everything else. You determine what the discipline is. And if the bigger the ego, the smaller the discipline. The more power you have. But you cannot tell me where the boundary of that is. And even if you get down to Planck's scale, because you get into a little Heisenberg issue of the uncertainty and all those good little things, i.e. there's no boundary except up here, psychologically. Same thing. No, there are no boundaries. I don't give a damn who says. There are no boundaries. I'm God. All right. Granularity gets into the discipline again. Another dialectical issue. Back to the color thing, the reds in terms of what the red is and all this other good stuff, where the red is. Okay, got three aspects of this, I would say. Gets into your issue about the boundary. I think it's what you're talking about. Where's the discipline line in between the two fingers, whatever it may be? It's the same kind of thing. Where's the boundary? It doesn't exist. And then we have the content. How are you going to define the content? That's a good one. Gets back to the language thing. Who defines the content? In terms of what? I don't think we can do that. And the dialectical issue. That red in terms of the white. The white doesn't exist by itself, it exists in terms of what it isn't, i.e. what's around it. So that's the granularity issue. How fine do you want to be fine? And that discipline all depends how big the ego is and how much narcissism you have. And how much you want to defend your territory. I know I'm a cynic, but I think it's a lot of it's true. I think you look in academia where we are. All these fights that you have when we're published in Paris and stuff like this. Frankly, I'm too damn old to care. I don't care what I publish or don't publish. If you like it or want it. But the problem is somebody coming up through the university with all that structure and stuff like that, you're faced with a problem right there. You're faced with all those people with big egos because I got a discipline and stuff like that. And I'm going to spank you. Gets back to that other cartoon. The smaller the discipline, the harder the spanking. Bam! You're doing philosophical sociology. Bam! You get back into philosophy. Bam! There you are. I think that explains discipline in many ways. Of course you have legitimate discipline, stuff like that. But go over that. All right. So the end is discipline. How granular are you going to granularize something? Granularize it out of existence? Or you have an information entropy. You carve something up so fine it doesn't exist anymore. It becomes meaningless. And the finer, the more granular it gets, the more difficult it is to define it. I think it's sufficient and necessary. We all know what that is. We go over all that. Now we get back to the number of the problem. Is it sufficient and necessary, stuff like this. Now, what I would argue, we'll get into science and technology here in a second. And again, I think that's subjective. What's the boundary between science and what's the boundary between that technology? I think what happens is that you have somebody like Newton. I'll give you an example of Newton. He's kind of like the natural philosopher, he was a natural philosopher, Descartes and all the others. They go out in their field, and they're more specialized than they were before as folks. So they're not just consciously creating a field, but they're working the field, like geometry, and all that stuff starts to shake itself out into these general areas. Geometry being different than the calculus, and I know they're related, but what happens is you start drifting into some of these other areas. For the natural philosophers, there's more of a continuum of thinking, but now we try to draw the boundaries among these areas and categorize them in little boxes. So what happens is that Descartes then ultimately can become a disciplinary if Descartes decided to specialize in geometry or Newton or physics. And what kinds of physics? We get down to optics. You get some of these other specialized. You get what branch of optics? Well, you can kind of subdivide that as a physicist and go as far as you want. You can make as specialized an area as you want. Like the example about the vacuum cleaners earlier. I can take something about electromechanics and stuff like this, and I can really carve it down into a real specialized area, and I can give you issue certificates on how to assemble a vacuum cleaner, make a real specialized type of a thing. And you can get worse than that. A little bit ridiculous, but I think in some cases that maybe that's what's happening. We don't have any cross-disciplinary thinking. We don't think as natural philosophers. I think it gets back more into the ethos. We're not natural philosophers anymore. We're technicians. And so we don't take the view of Descartes. What we're trying to do with these little advertisements, the Inventors Assistance League, I want to try to convert that to a college, a Renaissance college. See, it's interesting. I'm going to give the personal experience, because you asked me some time ago, how did I come about to where I'm at? And so I've been struggling all these years. How does a philosopher make money? Not teaching philosophy. I'm going to go out there and go into the technological world and find some kind of application. So I go there and describe something as a technical writer, blah, 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 blah. But it's interesting. You see, I'm using the inductive approach. I go out there and learn how this is made, this is assembled, software. Let me put this thing together so I can use it for later.
Okay, while you fix that, can I just have them, please, in order to avoid more problems that we are having, some mistakes that are being done, remember that each of these sessions, the people attending the session have the option of a paper related to a session. So we need you to sign, the attendees, each session to sign the form that we are doing around, because some people sign the first one, then they sign the second one. So we're having this kind of problem. I would like, so as long as we are here, we are solving the problem. But via email, we're not going to be able to solve it. So please, there is another form now going on. Be sure to sign all of it. All of you, please. And then the next hour will be another form. Because, you know, the optional papers are related to the attendee of each session. So we need that in that way. And at the same time, I'm not sure, I didn't expect that many people of you here today. I'm gonna make a distribution of this thing. If someone is not having that, it's in the way, okay? It's a draft, not a draft, regarding the difference between higher education and higher instruction. Mm-hmm. Something Professor G and me disagree completely. But this is the position of half of a plenary session we had in March, that half of the people agreed with me, the other half of the people agreed with him. It was so interesting, so we invented a debate between two persons. You remember that? So this is the opinion of the half of the plenary session, not the opinion of the other half. Okay, so I'm going to distribute that. Well, the problem was really not regarding the education and instruction, but regarding e-learning. Some people like me would not take e-learning as education, but as learning, as instruction. And people like him say that he can teach via e-learning. I don't know. He can teach, no. He can educate via e-learning. I don't know how. Okay, so that's the difference between him and me. Not regarding the difference between instruction and education, but regarding e-learning. What is e-learning? Instruction or education? In my opinion, this is instruction. In his opinion, it's also education.
And what this does is right on the heels of that. You go out and I said, okay, I like the flower things of philosophy and all this other stuff. And here I'll go down here and describe this kind of stuff in a factory. I thought, wait a minute. Over the years, I've kind of realized, okay, I picked up all these, you might call them data points. I learned how to describe this, software, fiber optics. I learned I'll write a fiber optic design handbook, build handbook 415B. And a few things like that. So I pick up a little bit here, a little bit there, a particular thing there, a techie thing there, a techie thing there, and I absolutely hate technology. But what I do, I extrapolate from all that. And what we have in logic, we have inductive and deductive logic. What is inductive logic? You take the data points and you abstract from those data points into a larger world, a synthesis. So I go out as a philosopher, and I should know this as a logician. I'm going to take that, I learn how to do all this stuff, then I can come back and drop back on 4 or 5 different fields and say, oh, now I begin to see what science looks like, and start looking at theories of science, scientific method, and all these great things. Now I see that as that's the inductive relationship, going from the technology into the science, the education, the techne into the episteme. Then I could be, but if you come out of the philosophy department not having any of this stuff, and you're the philosopher all heady, and you go out into the real world, and you try to do the deduction, and you say, I take the world of what I think is a theory and apply it, you're in trouble. And when I formalized, I taught auto mechanics. So in my first course I did, I said, okay, I know how to adjust Volkswagen valves, don't I? I go through Stockhell, and I can say, yeah, I know how to adjust Volkswagen valves. Now, go out and adjust the Volkswagen valve. And I tried. I hosed it up. Guess what? I had to call a mechanic. That means I had to have the field experience. So I go from the episteme down into the techne. Now it's a dialectical relationship, because without the episteme, you don't have the techne. Without the techne, you don't have the episteme, i.e., this in terms of what it is not, another dialectical relationship. So what I'm saying is that this takes care of itself. The sufficient and the necessary. I think that happens at those levels. So what we're doing with IL, I come out with the better assistantly. We don't help inventors because there's not too many of them, but we come out with an idea, and I say, I've got something particular, how to make one of these or that or whatever. But after a while, you're doing this stuff, how do I take all those particular things and come out with some larger things in terms of the natural philosopher? That's the idea of a Renaissance college. You not simply learn all the techie things, how to run that, or build one of these. What do you get out of the experience? You do 4, 5, 6, or 7 of these kinds of different projects, interdisciplinary, if you will, and you come out with an idea, generally, of how to do scientific methods and that kind of thinking. So you go from you do the induction. That's what the value of the techne is. So the techne, I would argue, is a necessary and sufficient, not sufficient, necessary for the episteme. The episteme is necessary, but the techne, not sufficient. But this, I think what's happened is like going through a Sham's outline. If everybody knows Sham. You do a few of these and you kind of get the idea and you play around with it, but you've got to play around with it. You've got to do the techne. You've got to play around with it in order to kind of get it. You can learn all the shams you want for the first 9 pages of the explanation. And you'll hose it up in the exercises until you start getting them right. But if you start with the exercise, you kind of play around with those and finally get the idea of what they're talking about in the first 9 pages. Another dialect. That's the relationship between the two. I would argue, is a kind of a dichotomy here. There's several ways. I think there are innate structures. I really do. I'm one of those. So you have this is Plato. Plato and Aristotle. Plato is the episteme. Aristotle is the more the techne. One in terms of the other. That's the value of learning the classic philosophers. Form, you're kind of like what a phone is. When I grew up, I knew what a telephone was. It was one of these. Hello? That's a phone too. Never know it. Oh, damn if I did. I'll damn if it works. It better work or I'll go back to hey, it works! LG, life is good. Anyway, don't ring. No, I don't want the damn thing to ring again. Okay, I'll put it on. So I do know how to do that, and I did. Anyway, that's a phone. That's a phone. That's a phone. Plato's form of a phone. That's Aristotle. That's an Aristotle, and that's an Aristotle. Plato, phone. That's Plato. And so the form is what the thing does, and all the theories about phones, stuff like this. That's one of the substances of phones. Inductive. So what happens, you go from the inductive deductive to the reverse. So the inductive, I can even, you think I can do
4 minutes.
You need to have to drive the car. All right, so theory application. You see where I'm going with this. You're going from the general to the specific, then reading Puel. That's his theories of induction. He's the geologist who came up with the future resembles the past. He's a geologist. William Puel, look him up. It's good reading. And anyway, education and training. It's the same thing. Education is the Plato, the theory, and the inductive, and then the training is the deductive. So one in terms of the other. That's how this stuff is related, I think, with different perspectives. So I think when we talk about stuff like we saw earlier, we saw what are the qualifications. I want to know, how does it work? Does it work? What does that mean? What is academic? I'm kind of get nitpicky about stuff like this. But I do think there's a dialectical relationship between the two. So, you look puzzled. That's my brother. But in a way, he doesn't have much to do with it. We can bring him in. That's interdisciplinary too. So there you have it. That's so it's dialectic, a little bit Eastern philosophy, that kind of stuff, done by a philosopher who's a Westerner and stuff like that. So I actually beat the clock, I think. Right? I beat the clock. Good. Damn. First time I took the finish.